There we go. All right, yes, the next exam that you have, which is the Monday after spring break, is over chapters 29 and 30. Now, chapter 31, which is the fungus, I'm not going to lecture on. There is a recorded lecture. I just posted it today in the recorded lectures section from a previously recorded class that I did on it. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to actually do the lecture on 31, but I would ask you to listen to that. Now, there's not going to be any questions on this exam or even on the last exam on chapter 31. So you're not tested on the fungus chapter. The only testing on the fungus part will actually be during the lab practical. We will be doing the fungus lab on Monday. So I ask that you guys between now and, well, a week from Monday, really, because spring break is next week, I ask that you listen to the chapter 31 lecture on fungus, so that when we come in to do lab on Monday, you're set and ready to go after the lecture exam, all right? There's no assignments for 31 either. Like I said, the only responsibility of 31 you have is going to be the lab information. And some of the questions on the lab practical may involve some of the stuff that we talk about, that are talked about on that lecture, some of the overlap between them. Does that make sense to everybody? To everybody, to all two of you? Very good. All right, let me see. I believe we had started on the flowering plants. I think we'd gotten into a little bit, but let's go ahead and go back to the start of the flowering plants. We're working our way, quite a journey now we've come through. We've come all the way from the chlorophytes and the green algae through the mosses with their dominant gametophyte generations, and then as we were moving along, the gradual trend that we saw in plants was a protection, right? Was a protection of that very delicate gametophyte. In the case of the mosses, they don't worry so much about the protection, right? They just produce these huge mats of gametophytes. But remember, they're fairly regulated to where they can grow. They can't grow everywhere. They need, very special conditions. It's only when we move into the gymnosperms, which is the previous group to the one that we're going to talk about today, the naked seeds, and the angiosperms, that we really start to see those evolutionary adaptations that allowed plants to, to take their place in prominence in the world. For example, if you look at the diversity of angiosperms, 90% of all plants are angiosperms. 250,000 species. 250,000 species of plants are angiosperms. That's amazing when you think about the species diversity in that. And usually when we talk about in biology, very oftentimes when we see things in biology of that kind of species diversity, that indicates to us that an organism that has been very successful at adapting to the environment. Now I'm actually kind of warm. You mean the screen is freezing? Yeah? Let me see what your connection is like. Oh, she just signed off. Maybe that's what she's going to try to do. All right, so 250,000 species. Obviously, we're talking about a group of organisms here that have done pretty good for themselves, at least in this environment, right? Remember, Mother Nature is very slick when it comes to that. As soon as organisms have adapted to their environment, well, then the environment can change. And I've pounded into y'all's head all semester long that in terms of evolution and species evolving, it's going to be the environment that dictates that. It's going to be an environment that decides who's going to be the ones that survive the most and reproduce the most. Let's see if Kaylee's got a better connection this time. The big thing that we see in the angiosperms is the fact that we see the arrival of flowers. We hadn't seen flowers up to this point, and we see the arrival of a fruit. Now we have seen seeds already. We've seen seeds from back in the gymnosperms, the conifers and the pine trees. But now we're seeing a seed that it's not only a seed, but also a seed that's not naked. Remember, that's what gymnosperm means. Gymno is the Latin root for naked, okay? For example, there are moray eels that live down in the Keys, and moray eels don't have a pectoral fin. They don't have a fin up here. Their throat area, that's where their throat is it doesn't have the fin. That's where the fins would normally be found. Moray eels, the genus for them is gymnothorax. Now, you know what gymno means, right? Naked, and thorax is throat. So gymnothorax eels are the eels that don't have the fins up in their throat region, right? You learn just a few little roots in biology. You learn just a few little root words in science, and you can apply them in many different places. You know, if you didn't know what gymnothorax ever was, but you knew what gymno was, and then you figured out that thorax was, you know, the throat area, then it's a naked throat, right? How cool that works. All right, now flowers are modified stems and leaves. As a matter of fact, everything that we see on plants for the most part are modified stems and leaves. The cones that we saw in the cone-bearing plants were modified stems and leaves, okay? All of these things have been modifications of the basic plant structure. And like I said, what we got here are fruits. It's the carpel. And if you remember what the carpel was, when we looked at the ovary was shaped kind of like a vase. Pencil doesn't work. Shaped kind of like a vase, and at the very bottom of that vase was that enlarged part, and that's the carpel. That's the part that's going to become the fruit. That's what we mean by the seed is covered. It's not naked. Angio, remember, angiosperm literally means a container. Angio is a container. So we're talking about the seed being in a container, specifically the container being the fruit. So it's the carpel that becomes the fruit. Let's see if my pen works now. Well, it does. This part, the vase, the stigma, the style, the carpel. Inside the carpel are the seeds or the ovules. And so what we're looking at in the tomato plant here, this, if I kind of put this in context of what I just drew, this would be the part that's down here at the bottom of the carpel, the female part of the tomato plant. You could see the seeds inside or the ovules. And then exocarp and mesocarp, those are just various layers of the carpel. The exocarp in a tomato is that very thin part on the outside, and the mesocarp is that, you know, the fleshy part of the tomato. And that's a beautiful picture in the background. It's becoming more and more springtime here, of course, but there are these flowers that Florida is very well known for. They're called phlox. And phlox, they're all the same species, which is kind of interesting because it's that variation thing again. Everything you see in the picture in the background there, let me get rid of my scribblings, those are all phlox. Those are all the same species. But notice there are purple ones and then lighter colored purple ones, and there are yellow ones, but all the same species, all phlox. Drive down 46, especially when we get into the really the big part of spring. You drive down Highway 46 in the fields, especially that one that's just north side of Highway 46, east of Round Lake. As you move a little bit further, closing into Orlando, there's just massive fields of these purple flowers. It's absolutely breathtaking. It's beautiful. Obviously, it indicates quite well why Florida is called the way it is, why Florida has the name that it does. All right, well, if it's all about flowers, then let's take a look at the flower one more time. You looked at this in lab. Remember, we've got the male and the female parts. The male parts are called the stamen collectively. The female parts are called the carpel or the pistil, okay? Pistil is an older name. I like that you use the word carpel. That's a more modern name. And all of these sexual organs, whether they be the stamen or the carpel, are in whorls. Everything in flowers in whorls, in circular arrangements. The sepals, you know, the leaf that's a green shaped. It's a petal basically, but it's green shaped. It's green color. There we go. Sepal right there. The petals. All of these are in whorls. The androecium would be the whorl. In this particular flower that we see, we do have a whorl of androecium. We do have a whorl of stamens. But in this particular flower, we've only got one carpel. Some flowers have more than one carpel. So that would be the whorl that we call the gynoecium. Radial and bilaterally symmetrical flowers. Remember, radial basically means radial symmetry, a circle. A circle has radial symmetry. That's not a circle, but you get the idea, right? So if I draw a line through that circle, no matter where I draw it, I divide it in two halves for the most part. And then, as I mentioned, bilateral symmetry is what we got, right? Left and right, top and bottom, forward and backwards. Most flowers that we look at are complete. That is, they are dioecious in the sense that they have both the male and the female parts. Although there are some flowers that are what we call incomplete. It doesn't mean there's anything not finished about the flower, but an incomplete flower only has either male or female. And that varies from species to species. There are some species of flowering plants out there that there is the male version and then the female version, and their flowers would be incomplete. So in this picture you see there, I don't know, is that an orchid? I think that's what that is, that incomplete. This is the male part on the right, that's the stamen, and then it's the carpel on the left-hand side. All right, so that's the parts of the flower. Flowers, of course, as we talked about in class, are the things that make plants sexy. They're what attracts pollinators. If you make a big flower, right? Not all flowering plants make big, gaudy, well, I shouldn't say gaudy, but big, brightly colored flowers. If you are a plant that uses pollinators, insects, to move the pollen around for the pollination process, then you're probably going to spend more time investing into flowers. Because as I said, flowers are the attractive part. If you want to grow a butterfly garden, they'll tell you yellow flowers are a good thing to grow because butterflies are sensitive to the color yellow. But all it is just a way to attract pollinators. They're what makes plants sexy because they want the pollinators to come crawl around on the flower. And when they do, the pollen then is attached to the pollinator, to the insect, and when the insect flies to the next flower, well, there you go. You get the pollen that's moved from the male part of one flower to the female part of another flower. If you look at them, very oftentimes flowers are designed in such a way to grab your attention. Like this is a tiger lily. See the tiger lily, like with the yellow inside and the red on the outside. It almost makes you want. It focuses your attention. It always kind of reminds me of driving by an airport at night. If you drive by like the Orlando airport at night on the freeway right in front of it, you can see the blue landing lights, and they're flashing, showing you where to land, right? So they're directing the pilot, land here, don't land over here, land where these blue lights are showing you to land. I kind of think of flowers at being that way too. Very oftentimes. They're very strongly contrasted, like with a very dark center and yellow leaves on the outside. Again, sometimes they're relatively small. Small flowers could either be flowers or organisms that are pollinated, or plants that are pollinated by smaller insects, or if they make small flowers, they may use wind as pollination. Not every flowering plant makes use of a pollinator. And if you think about that from an evolutionary point of view, it makes perfect sense. Living organisms have an energy budget, all right? It's kind of like a monetary budget. You only have so much energy to divert to different parts of your life. You got energy that's necessary for cell maintenance and digestion and endocrine functions and all those other kinds of things. But also part of your energy is necessary for reproduction. So in the case of many plants, they're not going to spend a lot of time building flowers. They're not going to spend a lot of energy building fancy, colorful flowers if they're just using the wind as a pollinator, because they're not trying to attract anything. If you're wondering what that flower is down here in the lower right, this is an interesting study that I read about. There are certain insects, certain species of bees, for example, that are, they can see ultraviolet light. They can see UV light. We can't see UV light, but they can. So what they did is they took this flower that was very often pollinated by bees, and I don't remember exactly what species it was, but when you look at it under normal light, it doesn't have much of a contrast. Remember I said it's contrast that's really important, right? That light center or that dark center against a light background or vice versa. But what they found out, even though the flower under normal light didn't really stand out in contrast, when they took a photograph of the flower under ultraviolet light, this is what it looked like. So again, a very strong contrast, right? The lighter colored petals and the very dark colored center where, of course, the stamen and the carpels are going to be. I think that's kind of neat. Kind of lets us know that there are certain insects out there, at least in this case of the bees, who are sensitive to light outside of the visible light spectrum. So they can actually see UV light. All right, as I said, flowers make plants sexy. So you can either attract the pollinator by the way the flower looks, and then once the pollinator's in there, you're going to give it a little bit of a treat. It's kind of a behavioral sort of thing, to be honest with you. If pollinators moved from flower to flower, never got anything from it, then they would stop doing it. They're not doing it for the benefit of the flower. It's not like the insects in the flower sat down and said, all right, let's have an agreement. You're going to pollinate me. It doesn't work that way at all, of course. The flowers, the plant, provides something for the insect, right? Provides a little bit of nectar, provides a little bit of sustenance, a little bit of food. So there's a reward for that insect coming and crawling around that flower. Of course, unbeknownst to the insect, while it's crawling around that flower, especially if you think about bees, when you look at them closely, they look kind of furry. I hesitate to use the word fur because fur is hair, and insects, only mammals have hair, but they have those little bristles, and those bristles are great for holding pollen. They can be dusted with this pollen, and then they fly to the next flower for another meal, and of course, as I said, the pollen is deposited there. So you can provide an incentive like food. You can provide another incentive in a very unusual type of way. The flower that I'm talking about here is one called Ophrys. This is Ophrys on the left-hand side. This is what Ophrys looks like. That's an odd-looking flower, isn't it? Well, Ophrys uses the wasp that you see in the upper right as its pollinator. That's its predominant pollinator. In this particular case, Ophrys does not supply any sort of nectar or food for the bee, but what it does do, it tricks the bee into thinking that that's a female wasp, and the male wasp comes down and attempts to mate with the female wasp, which is just a flower. Now, being an insect, chances are they don't pick it up the first time around, so this flower has been able to survive for the years that it's been on Earth because it wasps never learn, I guess, right? And that wasp, as soon as it disconnects from this one flower going, well, that was nothing going on there, it sees another one and immediately thinks it's another female. Ophrys is the plant. The method is tricking you. And they fly to the next flower thinking it's a female again, and yet it's not. And, you know, what you basically get is pollination, and I suppose a pretty frustrated wasp. But that's kind of neat, though, right? As long as you can get them over there to you and crawling around, however you do that, either by tricking them or providing something to eat, either way, you're going to get the same benefit. This picture down below is in your book, but what I love about this is how very complicated flowers become when it comes to getting this pollination. You can see the bee has, you know, he's got his head stuffed pretty far there in the flower. The stamen, of course, are the male parts, and the yellow part at the top, that's where the pollen is. The way this particular flower works, when the bee steps on the base of the flower, there's a trigger mechanism that actually causes the stamen to wrap around, as you can see it's in this picture, to actually wrap around the insect so that that insect gets fully covered with the pollen that the stamen are producing. So, you know, insect pollination is a critical part of these plants' survival. And it probably has a lot to do with the diversity we see of them. I guarantee it has a lot to do with their ability to spread throughout the environment, because vectors, like this case, vectors can carry disease, but this is also a vector. Things that move the pollen from place to place, these pollinators would do an extremely effective job of being able to spread out the pollen throughout the area. And as a matter of fact, when we look back at evolutionary changes on Earth, we find that flowering plants and insects kind of evolved at about the same time. I'm not saying they weren't there before, but the diversity of insects and flowers kind of went hand in hand. So insects became very species diverse and flowers became species diverse about at the same time, more or less, give or take a few million years, right? But that indicates to us that the close relationship between these two. In other words, the success of the insects was dependent on the success of the flowers. The success of the flowers, flowering plants, was dependent on the insect. And so they both benefited from this. I heard a story a while back that in China they've lost quite a bit of their pollinating bees due to pollution and habitat destruction. So bees are very good pollinators for flowers as well as for flowers of agricultural crops, you know, things that we grow to eat. And with the loss of these pollinators, or the decrease in these number of pollinators, the Chinese agricultural system was having problems. So what they did, they may not have a lot of bees anymore, but China has a lot of people. They actually paid people to go out with little paintbrushes and kind of do the Darwin thing. They would go along and take their paintbrush and they would brush it on the stamen of one plant, getting pollen onto the paintbrush, and then move over to another plant and brush that onto the stigma of the carpel. What I mean by Mendel, that's how Mendel got his pea plant crosses that he was looking for. Pretty exciting job, huh? Imagine walking around all day and your job is to take a little paintbrush and just go over to one flower and get a little bit of stamen, and then you walk over to another flower and brush that off on the stigma, and then you go get some more pollen from some more stamen. I don't know. I would think that that job could get pretty tedious pretty doggone quick. All right. Now, let's turn our attention to the fruit part. Fruits and flowers are connected to one another. Well, the trumpet plant or trumpet tree, the yellow flowers I brought in the other day in lab and had those large pea pods, very similar to what you see here. What we're looking at here is a very simplified explanation to perhaps how fruits came about. All right. So what we're looking at here on the far left-hand side, I know what you're looking. It's a snap pea, right, or a green bean or green pea, snap peas we call them. Over on the far left-hand side, let's imagine a time in the past in which there was a leaf that looked something like this, and on that leaf there were ovules, there were seeds on that leaf. Okay, so we're talking sometime in the evolutionary past. And eventually through time, through mutations and through a natural selection, what we would have got is a leaf that folds over on itself and forms a suture or closes up. Now, the reason why that would be selected for, the reason why that would be desired by Mother Nature, if you will, and I'm kind of really twisting the word of evolution, is because when you fuse the margin, you create that suture, what you do is you protect the seeds inside. It's all about the protection part, right? It's all about protection. We're trying to protect that seed, and then if something else that comes along is going to feed upon the casing, which is really the carpel, right? That's what that is. That's the carpel. The carpel being a modified leaf. Quite clearly, you can see it looks like a modified leaf. In the case of peas and stuff, they have a very thin carpel. Carpels can be very thin or very thick, and inside are the protected seeds. You can see the picture here. There's the carpel, and there are the seeds inside. So this is just in this particular species, this is just a hypothesis, and it seems reasonable. I keep keeping my leg tangled up in my mouse cord there. That's why I keep moving around that way. You can see it's very reasonable to be able to visualize a seed or a leaf over on the left-hand side with those seeds, and then something causes the leaf to fold over, and then a suture forms, and then you're protecting the seeds. And since you're protecting the seeds, more of them are going to survive, more of them are going to germinate, more of them are going to reproduce, right back to Darwin again, right back to differential reproductivity. That's what I mean when I said at the beginning of the semester, this is really just an entire class about evolution, going through the different critters. So when the ovary wall or the wall of the carpel thickens, it becomes the fruit, and they become really thick like a tomato, or like we see in the grapefruit. In the nectarine, this is the seed, and this is all part of the carpel, the fruit part. Of course, the seeds in the grapefruit are around in this area, and all of this is the carpel. This would be the exocarp, and this would be the mesocarp, the coating on the outside and the fleshy part. Protects the seeds, aids in dispersal. Seeds can also be dry too, right? Or excuse me, not seeds, but fruits. Fruits can be fleshy, like the nectarine and the ruby grapefruit and the tomato, or they can be dry, like the milkweed or nuts. Nuts are seeds. They're dry fruits. Fleshy fruits, another example, like guava and mangoes are fleshy fruits, which is interesting. I love the taste of guava and mango, but I can't stand eating them. The fleshiness of them bothers me. Some folks don't like those. My wife loves guava, and like I said, I love the flavor, but the actual fleshiness is just too much for me to handle, I guess, for some strange reason. Now, fruits come in all kinds. Like I said, they come in the true berries, like the tomato is a true berry. Remember, anything with a seed is a tomato, or is a tomato, with seed is a fruit. So even though tomatoes are considered vegetables, they're by botanical terms a fruit. The pericarp is the fleshy part that we eat. The exocarp is going to be that thin layer on the outside. Those are the true berries. In the fruits that we call drupes, drupes are like nectarines, cherries, anything that has a pit, which is actually the seed. And once again, we have an exocarp, we have a mesocarp, which is the fruit part, and then the pit, in this case, is the endocarp. Well, actually, not the seed, but the surrounding, the outer layer of the seed is the endocarp. Blackberries, raspberries, those are all aggregate fruits. The little tiny balls in a raspberry, or in those pictures in the blackberry, each one of those has come from a single ovary in a single flower. All right, so strawberries, blackberries, those kinds of things, when you look at where it says the ovary and the seed, those are all many ovaries in a single flower. So this would be an example of a flower that has more than one ovary, more than one carpel. You know, the picture I showed you before, we had lots of stamen but one carpel, but I said it isn't that the case in all flowers. In the flowers that produce these kinds of aggregate fruits, what we basically have is one flower, but many carpels. Now, every carpel is going to produce a seed, so each one of those little balls, if you will, is a carpel. Right, so this is an aggregate fruit. The legumes are split down the edge. They have those sutures. Legumes are the beans. Fruits, samaras, which are dry fruits, like, for example, in maples and elms. Interestingly enough, though, look at this. That kind of looks like a pine seed, doesn't it? Remember, we looked at the pine seeds in lab the other day, and I showed you ones in lecture. Doesn't that look like a pine seed quite a bit? Now, the seed is covered. It's not a naked seed. But in this particular case, samaras or maples, elms, and ashes that make this kind of fruit, these samara kind of fruit, they're not depending upon fruit consumers to spread them. All right. Again, think what's going on when an organism comes along and grabs some berries and it's eating those berries. It's dropping seeds along the way. In some cases, it ingests the seeds, and then upon defecation, those seeds can germinate. But a samara, there's no real fruit there. The seed is covered by a very thin carpal layer, but that wing that comes out of the pericarp, part of the ovary again, works just like the wing on the pine seeds. These are used for wind for dispersal. So my question to you now, with all of that, do the fruits of maples and elms, do samaras look like pine seeds because of their close relatedness, or for another reason that we've talked about a few dozen times? What would you say? It's got to be you, Daniela, because I'm the only other one in class with you. So if you don't have the answer, then we're stuck. Why does this look like a pine seed? Is it because maples are related? Yeah, good answer. Sure. And pineapples. Now, pineapples actually are whereas aggregate fruits, these guys are one flower, many carpels. Pineapples are examples of what we call multiple fruits. And what we mean by that is many flowers, okay? So we have individual flowers that form fruits around a single stem. So up here you got one flower, many carpels. Down here you have many flowers, more than one flower, many flowers. So when you look at a pineapple and you cut it open, that's what each of those little sections in the pineapple, when you look at it, that's what each of those are. Each of those are the pericarp, the outer covering of the ovary for each individual flower. All right. Now let's talk about how these things get dispersed around. Well, there's a number of ways. With fruit dispersal, it can be by ingestion and transportation. You know, this little rodent that's feeding upon those berries is going to drop those seeds, as we've talked about. There's double-winged samaras. Red maples here in Florida. My red maple in my backyard is doing this. It produces these double-winged samaras. Explosive action. A witch hazel, for example. The seeds are actually kind of like the spores that we were talking about in the ferns. They can actually be shot out to increase their dispersal. Poor old Cooper is very familiar. My dog Cooper, when I take him in the woods, is very familiar with these kinds of seeds, the ones that have barbs and hooks on them. They use animals. They stick onto you. Like, it almost looks like Cooper a little bit. Cooper's nose is a little bit shorter than that. But these things stick onto the animals, stick onto the organism, and then, of course, sometime later they drop off, and guess what? You've been dispersed. It's all about the dispersal. So either you can provide something to eat or hooks and spines. Okay, so there's something to eat. You got some spines there and some hooks. Wind, right? Like in the case of the dandelion. Case of coconuts floating in the water, right? Or like in the mangroves, when we talked about the mangrove pencils, same thing. The seeds are transported by the water. All of these different ways of getting around, though, and all of this whole idea of providing, some sort of incentive for dispersers or some sort of way to engage dispersers, either by giving them something to eat or by sticking to you, all allowed for this massive colonization of flowering plants, these 250,000 species. These guys, these plants were the experts at figuring out ways to disperse and get away and colonize new environments. And remember, when you colonize a new environment, there is the danger, of course, of extinction. But if you do happen to survive, there's the benefit of only having the resources to yourself for the most part, right? So if you're a flowering plant colonizing a new environment that there aren't very many or other flowering plants around, then you've got pretty much the place to yourself. So that's going to be an incentive to disperse. Not only the fact that we talked about that your parents are going to want the offspring to disperse, so they'll have to compete for them. Right? Once that endosperm is gone, and once that plant has done what it can to give that little seedling a start, then the rest are on your own. So, speaking of seedlings and all that, let's take a look at the reproduction in flowering plants. All right. So I'm going to start up at the upper left. I'm going to start up here with the flower. All right, so the mature flower is on a sporophyte, all right? And remember, sporophytes are the things that produce spores. Now, the spores in this case are microscopic, and they're retained inside of the sporophyte. The spores are going to give rise, they're going to germinate into a gametophyte. Unlike the mosses, though, we're not going to have an obvious gametophyte. There's not going to be a carpet of gametophyte tissue. It's all going to be kept microscopic. The same theme over and over again. We're protecting that delicate gametophyte. All right, so we'll start off with the flower. We've got the carpel, which is the female, and the anther, where the pollen is produced in the male part. Now, many times in order to limit, you don't ever really stop, but in order to limit self-pollination or inbreeding, basically, the pollen and the seeds may mature at different times. So, and if I remember right, in most flowers, I believe the pollen matures first, because then the wind's going to blow it away, and then the seeds mature. So hopefully by the time the seeds are ready to be fertilized, most of the pollen of the same self plant has, drifted off into the other regions. All right, let's go along the male cycle first. So the microsporangium and the microsporocytes. All right. Microsporangium, we talked about a sporangium. This is a microsporangium. It's the male spore-producing structure. So what's going to happen is through meiosis, it's going to produce a spore, just like we talked about in the ferns producing a spore. We call this a microspore. But now that microspore is not going to be dispersed. It's going to stay inside the anther. Now inside that microspore, that nucleus there is going to divide. And what it's going to do is going to form a generative cell, and it's going to form a tube cell, and there's also going to be a tube nucleus. All right, now, when that pollen grain makes it to the stigma of the female plant, it sticks to it. That pollen then attaches to the stigma, and the pollen tube begins to grow down the style. Inside of that pollen tube, there are going to be two sperm. There's the tube nucleus and two sperm. And there's a reason why there's two sperm, and I'll get to that in just a second. So the pollen tube is going to grow and grow and grow, and then it's going to find an ovule. So in this case, we've got 6 ovules. And I'm going to, where's my picture? There we go. The sperm is then going to move into the ovule through the micropyle, right? So this pollen right here is going to come down the stigma, the style, make its way through a micropyle, because inside of there is the seed that needs to be fertilized. Fertilization is then going to occur, and then we get fertilization of the seed, but we also get something called double fertilization. Double fertilization. Now, I'll come back to that in just a second, because I want to stop right here and pick up the female part, because I want to bring the two parts together before we keep going in this direction. All right, so back on the female, we have the carpel with a megasporangium, which undergoes meiosis, produces a megaspore. Now, when cells undergo meiosis, remember from Bio 1, you make 4 resultant cells. Now, in the megasporangium, what you do is you produce those 4 resultant cells from meiosis. 3 of them are going to die, 3 of them are going to disintegrate, and leaving behind one surviving megaspore. Now that surviving megaspore is then going to continue to divide until we end up with what you see here is a whole bunch of cells in the embryo sac. This is the female gametophyte again, right? Retained inside the sporophyte. That one surviving megaspore is going to give rise to what we call antipodal cells, polar nuclei, synergids. These are all cells, and then of course the egg. All right, now let me go a couple of slides forward and then come back so I want to show you, I want to show you this in a little more detail. All right, there we go. So same thing. We're right. This is the stigma, the style, the carpel, and all that sort of stuff. Here's the megaspore. The megaspore is going to divide by meiosis once. All right. So it's going to divide by meiosis once. You get 4 cells. 1, 2, 3 will die off, leaving behind 1. That one is going to undergo mitosis 3 times. Once, twice, 3 times. Count them. That's 8 cells. All right, producing 8 cells. All right, now, one of those cells is going to become the egg. All right, 3 of those cells are going to become the antipodal cells. That's these up here. All right, those are the antipodal cells. So we got 3 antipodal cells. We have an egg cell. We have 2 synergid cells. There's a synergid there and a synergid there. What are all these cells about, right? We only need 1 cell for the sperm to fertilize. Why do we have so many? All right, well, it has to do with the nature of what goes on in angiosperms and the protection of the young. Now, the egg, we know what that does, right? The egg is what gets fertilized by the sperm, and that makes the offspring. What do the synergids do? The synergids are on either side of the egg cell, just inside the micropyle. And what the synergids do is they tell the pollen tube when to stop growing. So they direct the pollen tube towards the micropyle, probably through chemical means, right? And then once the pollen tube reaches that spot, all right, once it reaches that spot right there, then what the synergids are going to say is, all right, you've stopped growing, and then release the sperm. And the sperm is then released into this embryo sac. All right, now, as you remember, sorry to keep going back and forth, there were 2 sperm, right? 1 sperm fertilizes the egg. Okay, 1 sperm fertilizes the egg, just like we would expect to happen. The other sperm unites with these 2 polar nuclei. I guess I will, Daniela. You have a good day too. Thank you. So the other sperm unites with those 2 polar nuclei. So we get 2 sperm, 1 fertilizing the egg, 1 uniting with the 2 polar nuclei. Now we'll come back to the polar nuclei in a second. Let me go ahead and talk about the antipodals for a second. The 3 antipodals at the top, not sure what they do. Not sure exactly what they do. There's some theories out there that it might have something to do with balancing out the embryo sac or something like that, but for the most part, we're not really sure what those cells do. There you can see a picture here under a microscope. Here's the 2 synergids. We're assuming this is the zygote since it has 2 nuclei. This is the other male nucleus here, perhaps, and this is that 3N part. All right, now the 3N part comes from the two polar nuclei plus the other sperm. Remember, there are two sperms. So we get a 3N, we get a triploid structure. Now, back to that picture. What's that all about? Double fertilization. One sperm fertilizes the egg, one sperm combines with the polar nuclei. All right, now the one that combines with the egg becomes the zygote. The one that combines with the polar nuclei and forms that 3N structure, that's the endosperm. Now remember, at the very beginning of this lecture, I said that the endosperm is the food source for the developing young. So the reason behind double fertilization in angiosperms, and they're the only ones who do it, it doesn't happen in gymnosperms, is that other sperm forms with the polar nuclei to provide that initial sustenance of food, right? That initial endosperm. So then we got little junior growing right here. May have one or two cotyledons, right? Remember I said cotyledons are primitive, or not primitive, excuse me, embryonic leaves. This one has two, so it would be a dicotyledon or a dicot. The endosperm is the food. The embryo, of course, is the embryo. The seed coat, which is sporophyte tissue, protects the seed. That seed then, of course, makes its way out, however, whether it's in a fruit or by wind, and finds some place to germinate, and we're back around to the cycle again. So the big difference here between reproduction in angiosperms and reproduction in gymnosperms is going to be that double fertilization, right? Double fertilization, which is a means by which to increase the odds that your offspring are going to survive. Remember, that's kind of a theme that we've touched on throughout the semester. If most of your offspring are going to die, or most of your gametes are not going to be fertilized or do any fertilizing, you're going to make lots of them. But if your offspring are more protected, like it is in this particular case, and if you think about animals, the way the mammals do it, then you can produce fewer offspring, because the offspring get a little bit of a head start. They get a chance. They either get the placental interface, like we see with mammals. They get to use the nutrition in the yolk sac, like birds do in the egg, or in this particular case in the plants, the developing plant gets to use the endosperm. Remember I said when you pop popcorn, the white part, that's the endosperm. That's the starch. That's the food, the sugar, okay? All right. Go through these next two slides. We already did those. We saw that in class. That's what I just went through there. All right, now that we've talked about reproduction, let's talk about their evolution, and then we'll talk about the diversity we have here. Angiosperm evolution, another thorn in Darwin's side, right? Darwin had that problem with the Cambrian explosion where it looked like organisms in the fossil record appeared pretty much all at once, relatively speaking. About 20 million years they appeared. And that was bothersome to him because, remember, at the time, he was only aware of the pace of evolution, what we call gradualism, right? Gradual changes through time. But remember, punctuated equilibrium and cladogenesis, and many times species arise by branching, right? Through punctuated equilibrium, little or no changes followed by rapid changes. And again, this is something Darwin didn't understand. So when he writes here that the rapid development in 100 million years, as far as we can judge, of all the higher plants within the recent geological times, according to him, is just an abominable mystery, something he could not figure out. Now, this didn't happen during the Cambrian explosion. Cambrian explosion was 500 million years ago, but this is what happened among angiosperms again. It wasn't really that fast. It was within 100 million years. And again, Darwin may have recognized the length of time, but again, he didn't realize how fast evolution can sometimes occur because he's still operating on the gradualism part. We think flowering plants start to show up around 125 million years ago or so, although there's been some recent evidence to suggest they may be a little bit older than that. Some of the earlier ones were Archifructus sinensis over here. This is an extinct one about 125 million years ago. Montsechia vidalii is one of the ones that are indicated as being maybe even more ancestral than Archifructus. It lived more than 125 million years ago. The inset right there shows evidence of seeds and fruits. That's why we're assuming these are angiosperms. This is what Archifructus may have looked like. May have been a aquatic plant, right, with its roots down in the substrate, and then the fruits and the flowers sticking up above the water. The reason why we think it may have been an aquatic plant, and it's hard to tell from looking at a fossil, but we've identified those as stamen, these as carpels, and these little things may have been floats. So sort of like in the brown, the seaweed, the kelp. Remember, the kelp used those floats to help it float so it could, reach to the top of the water, be able to take advantage of photosynthesis. So these are the oldest known angiosperms, these two guys, 125 in Montsechia, which is somewhere over 125, but they're probably not the first. Remember, finding things in the fossil record, finding fossils of organisms that had hard bony structures is relatively rare, but finding fossils of soft-bodied organisms is even more difficult. You can see here's one of Archifructus and Montsechia. These are actually pretty good fossils, but these things are not horribly common, especially on these types of critters. All right, so somewhere back there was a recent common ancestor. Let's talk about the ones that are alive today. Of all of the plants that are around today, Ambarella, which is this odd-looking sort of flower, it almost looks like a flower that's got some problems, dying or something like that. That's probably the closest living relative to these original angiosperms is Ambarella. Ambarella has a lot of characteristics that we found in some of these ancient angiosperms. Now, Ambarella is only found in a few places on Earth. It's off the east coast of Australia. I believe that's the Caledonia Islands, or if I remember correctly, my geography, right there. That's where we find Ambarella. One little tiny spot. And that's a pretty good evidence that that's an ancestral kind of plant. A lot of things in Australia. Australia is a continent separated from the rest of the world a long time ago. So Australia was a habitat far off by itself for quite a long time. So organisms in those areas, if they had no reason to evolve, no changes in environment, they would pretty much stay the way they were for millions of years. We call these things living fossils. Ambarella would be an example of a living fossil. Living fossil refers to an organism that either looks like Cooksonia that we talked about earlier, looks like fossil organisms, or sometimes living fossils are organisms that we thought were dead, but come to find out they're still alive. Like when we talk about fish, we're talking about coelacanths. They're a living fossil. All right, we got Ambarella, the water lilies, the star anise, the magnolids, and then the monocots and the dicots or the eudicots. So Ambarella, let's now look at the water lilies. I'm sorry. Yeah, okay, all right. We can go into the monocots and the dicots right now, talk about their diversity, and then we'll look at we'll go back to that family, that cladogram again. All right, monocots again mean that the initial embryo only had one leaf. Dicot means it has two. But these terms, monocot or dicot, are paraphyletic. In other words, just because you're a monocot doesn't mean you're related. Just because you're a dicot, it doesn't mean related. Right now, what we've done is we've broken monocots and dicots up, but we have a new name for dicots. We call it the eudicots, and they're the most speciose, about 170,000 species. The monocots, still pretty speciose, 70,000. The eudicots or the dicots are the trees, shrubs, the beans, daisies, lettuce, oak, that kind of stuff. Monocots are grasses, grains, bananas, palms, grasses, sable palms. The Florida state tree, not really a tree at all. Palms, if you cut a cross-section, I have some in the lab that I'll try to remember to show you. If you cut a cross-section through a palm tree, it doesn't have the rings like we see in a normal tree, right? It doesn't have the rings, the concentric circles. It looks like it's actually a bunch of grasses that are stuck together. That's what a palm tree looks like on the inside. So palm trees are actually grasses. Now, difference between monocots and dicots. You looked at that little box in lab the other day, but once again, monocots, one embryonic leaf, dicots have two. Monocots, usually the venation, the tracheids, the xylem, and the phloem are parallel. And dicots are more of a net-like. If we look at the stem, and this is kind of what I was talking about, if you look through the cross-section of a palm, in monocots, the vascular tissue is scattered throughout, but in dicots, it's arranged in rings. Those are the rings that you're looking at when we count the rings of a tree. The roots are different between the two of them. Dicots have a tap root. You have one main root with the other roots coming off of it. The pollen is different, the number of openings. Monocots have 1, dicots have 3. And then we talked about the other day the number of floral organs, the number of stamen, the number of carpels, the number of sepals, the number of petals. If they're in multiples of 3, it's a monocot. Multiples of 4 or 5, it's a dicot. As I mentioned, though, be careful using the number of petals. Many times petals fall off. To me, probably the best way to tell them apart is by looking at the leaves. Think about the leaf coming off of a sable palm or a cabbage palm versus the leaf coming off of a maple tree, right? The sable palm leaf, that long tender leaf, or the saw palmetto leaf is long, like sword-like leaves with parallel veins. That's a good indication of a monocot. Seeing the cotyledon is going to be difficult. Got to cut open the tree to see the vascular bundles, pull it up to see the roots, need a microscope to see the pollen. Counting the floral parts is okay, but again, sticking with the leaf venation is probably one of your best ways to make sure that you got a monocot or a dicot or a eudicot. Okay, after Ambarella, we have the water lilies and the star anise and their relatives. There's the water lily. There's Ambarella again. What an odd-looking plant. We have, these are called the basal angiosperms. Remember, basal in phylogeny means the base group. So these were the original angiosperms. Not these necessarily, but the ones that they descended from were the base group. The American water lily up in the right. You see growing Venetian garden, see them growing everywhere. That's an example of a basal angiosperm. Only about 100 species of basal angiosperms. Moving out of there, we now have the magnolids, named after one of the more prominent magnolids, that magnolia tree, the quintessential southern plant. I love magnolias. I have one growing in my backyard. Look at the name. I love the name of magnolia, scientific name. Magnolia grandiflora. Grandiflora because it makes big flowers, right? Big, really nice smelling flowers too. Pepper is a magnolid. This is how pepper grows. Oranges is a magnolid. Oranges are a magnolid. Persea americana. Those are going to be oranges. All right. Beyond the magnolids, we have the monocots. At about 70,000 species, about 25% of all the flowering plants are monocots. Sable palm, right up here. Cabbage palm, Florida state tree. Saw palmetto, see what I mean by the leaves? Right? This is an orchid. We do have native orchids in Florida. By the way, all orchids in Florida are protected by Florida statute. In other words, if you pick an orchid, you can be arrested for that. It's against the law. Your lovely lawn of St. Augustine, that's a monocot as well. Like I said, grasses, palms, those kinds of things. Banana trees, if you think about it, those are all monocots. Anything that doesn't, if you cut it open and you looked at it, doesn't have those rings like we see in trees, is going to be called it's going to be a monocot. Big group, though, is the eudicots, 170,000 species. Swamp rose is an example. That's a pretty one. Florida Alecia, Chapmania floridana, this yellow one right up here, is endemic to Florida. That's really kind of cool. If there are other people in the room, I could ask everybody to know what endemic means, but endemic means it's only found there. Florida Alecia, that little tiny yellow flower there, is only found in the entire world, is only found in Florida. I've seen some of these actually growing on campus. Some growing on campus just off of the parking lot too, so they're not necessarily rare, but only found here, only found in Florida. That's really cool. So if you think about that from an evolutionary point of view, if something came through Florida and was wiping out the Florida Alecia, we could have a complete extinction of that species, right? Since it's the only place they're found. Beans are also dicots. The legumes, all the different kinds of beans, and the peas. the black beans and the navy beans. Oh, lima beans, which I hate lima beans. We get lots of things from seed plants, not just food. It does provide a lot of our food. About 80% of all of our calories are consumed by humans are from these these basic staple crops: wheat, rice, maize, potatoes, cassava, sweet potatoes. Actually, eating plants is more environmentally efficient, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Down below, a cow, in order to create 1 kilogram of beef, obviously eating the beef, a cow has to consume 5 to 7 kilograms of grain. So the argument many times of getting away from eating beef is 1 kilogram of beef is made from 5 to 7 kilograms of grain. Why not just eat the grain? Now, there are the ideas that you need certain protein, obviously, so that's important, but that's kind of, the world is a big beef eater. It's one of the biggest meat of organisms on the planet we consume. There's so many cows on the planet that actually, because cows are very flatulent, right? A lot of gas, that a lot of some of the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, some of that is methane from flatulent cows. That's how many cows there are. But interestingly enough, it's not the most common meat animal eaten on Earth. That's actually the goat. I didn't realize that. I didn't realize that it was a goat. So that means we don't eat a lot of goats in this country. It must mean that goats are consumed quite a bit in other parts of the world. Other things we get from plants are plant-derived medicines. The nice thing about medicines derived from plants is they oftentimes don't have the side effects that other pharmaceuticals do. Atropine, for example, is a pupil dilator. Atropine is a muscle relaxer. Digitaline, which we get out of foxglove, is a heart medication. Menthol. Quinine is important. It's good for malaria preventive. We get that from the cinchona tree. Taxol, which I talked about. Taxol that you find in gymnosperms. The Pacific yew is a gymnosperm. Very promising results in treatments of ovarian cancer. Tubo curare is a muscle relaxant. Curare is the Indians, native people of South America, would put curare on the tips of their blow darts, and then they would hunt with that. And when they would take that blow dart and that would hit an organism, the curare inside would cause muscles to relax to the point where even their breathing muscles relaxed. They would die, and they had their prey. Then there's also things like leukemia drugs and hosts of other kinds of things. So many things that we find among plants that we actually are probably unaware of all the medicinal properties, and that's a shame, because many of these medicinal plants come from areas in the world that we are rapidly destroying, like, for example, in the tropical rainforest. If you look at the picture down below, between 1975 and 2012, in this area of Brazil, the picture on the left is the before, 75, and then the one on the right is the after. The green represents tropical rainforest. The purple on the right represents human beings, civilizations. And then the areas where the green is missing in between are humans as well as cleared land. Down in the tropical rainforest, of course, these people are clearing land for agriculture. But I think I explained to you that, like the soil in Florida is relatively nutrient deficient, the soil in tropical rainforest is relatively nutrient deficient. In other words, plants in the tropical rainforest regions, most of the nutrients are taken up in the rapid plant growth. So there isn't a lot of base of nutrients in the soil. So when we come along, humans, and deforest, like cut down the tropical rainforest to grow crops, we're basically growing crops in very poor soil. So it needs to be heavily fertilized, which creates all kinds of problems. Or what often happens is when that land becomes just no longer usable or farmable, the farmer goes and cuts down more tropical rainforest to the point where we clear about 55,000 square kilometers of tropical rainforest each year, about the size of West Virginia. And if that continues, we got about 200 years until the tropical rainforests are gone. So not only would we lose perhaps some food sources or some medicinal sources, but of course all those trees being cut down doesn't help us when it comes to the amount of carbon dioxide levels rising in the atmosphere, right? Because loss of forests, loss of trees means you have less things that take in carbon dioxide. So this can all contribute to one of the contributors to global climate change. You remember, global climate change is a natural occurrence. What we're talking about in global climate change and the alarm everybody has about it is how much human beings are adding to that. And that really frustrates me sometimes when I hear people, especially people, politicians do this all the time. Well, I'm not a climate scientist, but I'm not sure about this global climate change. Well, if you're not a climate scientist, then 97% of all climate scientists out there agree that human beings are having a profound effect on global climate change. I'm not sure how a politician who admits they're not a climate scientist can just simply say, well, I'm not sure about this stuff, when 97% of the scientists out there say that it is occurring. And what they're saying is occurring is global climate change is being exacerbated or may be made worse by human beings. So, tropical rainforests, it's too bad. Think about not only the species of plants, but the species of animals. And another thing that's kind of in a sort of a spooky way is, as we get down the tropical rainforest, we might be unleashing different disease organisms and disease pathogens like viruses that could spread into the human population, that are maybe being kept in check because of where they are in the tropical rainforest, but once there's a lot of humans around, that might create a problem. Okay, now the last slide is just a summation of all the things that we've looked about, sort of the evolutionary developmental changes that have occurred as we've gone from mosses to flowering plants. Like, for example, the dominant generation, right? The generation is the most obvious. In mosses, it's the gametophyte. In ferns, it's the sporophyte. You remember the gametophyte of a fern was that thing you looked at under a microscope, that little tiny structure. In the conifers, or gymnosperms, and the flowering plants, the gametophyte has actually become even smaller. It's shrunk down to the microscopic size. Mosses aren't vascularized, so that means they got to stay low to the ground. They're dependent upon diffusion and osmosis. Ferns and the rest of them have xylem and phloem, so they can grow bigger. Mosses have flagellated sperm. That reflects the fact of where they live. They live in moist environments, and the sperm swim between droplets. Same with ferns. On the other hand, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, non-flagellated sperm. The reason why is the sperm is contained in the pollen. And the pollen is what gets dispersed. You don't need water to disperse pollen. You pollinators or wind will do that. Obviously, we don't see any seeds until we get into the gymnosperms and the flowering plants. No fruits until we get to the flowering plants. That's the only place we have fruits. The water required for fertilization ties in with the sperm. If you have flagellated sperm, you're going to need water. If you have flagella, there's a reason why. But the other ones, of course, the pollen is or water is not required because the sperm is contained within the pollen grain. Pollen grains are only found in the last two, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, and then whether the spores are different or not. Mosses and ferns typically tend to be homosporous. And what we mean by that is one spore, one type of spore, gives rise to both the male and the female, the Antheridia and the Archegonia. You remember on the fern plant, when we looked at the gametophyte under the microscope, that one gametophyte had both the male and the female parts on it. In the moss, of course, the Antheridia and the Archegonium were on the same plant as well. That's because the spore that they germinate from is a bisexual spore. Now, what we mean by bisexual in this context is that spore is going to give rise to structures that have both the male and the female part on it. On the other hand, in the gymnosperms and the flowering plants, they're heterosporous. Heterosporous means we have a pollen and we have an egg. Okay, so we have one type of spore that is found in the pollen, and then another type of spore that's found in the egg, and we only have those in the gymnosperms and the flowering plants. Okay. All right, so that's it for chapter 31, or I'm sorry, for chapter 30. Remember what I said at the beginning. Make sure that you do listen to chapter 31. I'm not going to lecture over it, but I do have a recorded lecture for you to listen to. Listen to that before we come back from spring break so that you're ready for doing lab on Monday, because we will do the lab number 6 on fungi. And again, the lecture exam does not include chapter 31. Exam 4 won't include chapter 31. You're not going to be tested on 31 in a lecture exam. The only time you'll be tested on that is when we actually do the next lab practical. So keep that in mind. Okay, folks, so that's it for today. Y'all have a good spring break. I will be checking my email over spring break, so if you have any questions, by all means, shoot me off an email. Make sure you're working on those field notebooks. Make sure you're studying. And make sure you have a little bit of fun, too. It is spring break. So y'all take care.